Hi folks, Rebecca here. Welcome to this interview with Edwards Corbin. I'm excited to share this information with you. I think it's really pertinent to be very aware of what emotional abuse looks like. From my history from the last 10 years in coaching, one thing I wanted to speak to is to just give a little bit of context in regards to this conversation, because we do jump in pretty quickly and we do specifically explore the dynamic of narcissism. But I wanted to give some context in regards to what emotional abuse looks like. Generally speaking, in my experience, what I've noticed is that abusive behavior is usually consistent. So it's not a one-off, it's not something that just happens. And what happens often with abusive behavior, emotional manipulation, etc., is because we're nice people, we don't often realize that it's happening. And as Katie and I mentioned in the interview, it can be a little bit like a poisonous gas. But I wanted to give a little bit more context so people have a better understanding before they're listening to the interview what constitutes emotional abuse. So these are just some kind of topics to speak to, but just really dropping into this and having some awareness. So obviously name calling, accusing, blaming, threatening, giving orders to another party, causing chaos, deliberately starting arguments with other people. The person may treat you well in front of others, but that changes when you're alone. Rejecting, refusing to acknowledge a person's value, their worth or presence, communicating that he or she is useless or inferior, or devaluing his or her thoughts and feelings. Denying a person's needs, denying a person's emotions, denying certain events happened or that things were said, denying perceptions, memory, and your sanity often by disallowing any viewpoints other than their own, degrading, any behavior that diminishes the identity, worthy, or dignity of the other person, again, name calling, mocking, teasing, insulting, ridiculing, emotional blackmail, this is where guilt is used or fear perhaps to get what the party wants, terrorizing and causing intense fear or terror in a person by threats, invalidation, and attempting to distort the other person's perception of the world by refusing to acknowledge their reality, and again, helping that person to not trust their own feelings and emotions, isolating, reducing or restricting freedom and normal contact with others, corrupting, convincing a person to accept and engage in illegal activities, exploiting the person for advantage or profit, minimizing, a less extreme form of denial that trivializes something that you've expressed as unimportant or inconsequential, unpredictable responses, for example, getting angry or upset in a situation that you wouldn't normally warrant a response, walking around on eggshells, drastic mood swings and outbursts, gaslighting, a form of psychological abuse which involves manipulation of situations or event that cause a person to end up confused or feeling like they're going crazy. And gaslighting causes the victim to constantly second guess themselves and wonder if they're losing their mind. Now, of course, folks, we want to look at these circumstances and through the eyes of awareness, from a soul level. Spirit asks us to see people as innocent, and I think it's important to remember that people who are emotionally abusive have often been emotionally abused themselves. Sometimes it's a learned behavior, sometimes it's a coping mechanism for trauma that they've experienced themselves. I think it's just important to remember that. However, human self, of course, means that we care about ourselves enough that we have a healthy boundary and we are treating ourselves with respect and value, so we're making wise choices in regards to where we place ourselves in relationship to this behavior. I think also too, sometimes it's important to realize that, there's symptoms, obviously, of emotional abuse, but also too that people who have been emotionally abused can often behave in a certain way, and I think that that's important to remember as well, because what we're wanting to do, of course, is identify, be aware of whether, and again, this is the thing, as humans, no doubt in our experience, we will always be on both sides of the coin, right? We will be the one perhaps who has been the perpetrator and the one who has been perpetrated against. of course, unfortunately, this is the way life works, in the respect that even though our intentions might be good, that people can often perceive our behavior as being abusive. So I think that's important to speak to, because it's often really easy, especially in the land of social media, to portray ourselves as the victim, where I think it's really important to just take accountability and be aware of perhaps where have I been the perpetrator. But of course, you know, that's coming from a place of balance and being really aware of that, and kind of going, okay, well, you know, where am I actually at? I think that's a very balanced perspective and means that you're willing to take accountability and change your behavior. So just wanted to give a little bit of context there. I think it's easy to forget that emotionally abusive people, you know, are often probably experiencing some of the traits that an emotionally abused person does, which is feeling insecure, losing their sense of reality, a low self-worth, questioning their own feelings, feeling confused, not feeling that they can speak up. But again, our work is to really be aware, and through awareness raise consciousness and help people who have been emotionally abused to heal, and also help people who are emotionally abusive to heal. So I just wanted to make sure that we have a very even perspective as we go into this interview. That's important to me. I think as a person who's choosing to be accountable, we want to do the work of forgiveness. We want to forgive others. We also want to forgive ourselves. So enjoy this interview with Katie Edwards Corbin. I'm sure you'll see she is an amazing lady who's got a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom in this area. So enjoy. Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to this powerful interview. I know it's going to be with the fabulous Katie Edwards Corbin. Welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for being here and allowing me to interview you about emotional abuse and narcissism. It's great to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here with you.
Yeah. So folks, if you don't know Katie, I'd like to introduce you. Katie is the creator of the Beyond Institute, which is so she's a business coach and a master marketer, and she's coached hundreds of practitioners. So you have your own practice as well, don't you, Katie?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Yes.
And she helps entrepreneurs to scale both virtually and in their brick-and-mortar businesses. So she's been, same as me, a decade over, last 10 years as an entrepreneur, and has the knowledge and wisdom to know what it takes to scale companies. So her energetic techniques, along with proven marketing methods, allow business owners to bust through their upper limit ceiling, and we all want that and know that feeling, which is fantastic. So she uses a technique with Systemic Constellation Work, which is often with the family dynamics. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, powerful stuff, which brings clients to actualize their full wealth potential. So Katie's mission is to help thousands of practitioners to have the wealth they deserve while serving their missions to the fullest extent. Freaking love that. So powerful. So her clients are from all over the globe, and she's worked with many 6 to 7 figures entrepreneurs. And when she's not working in her business, she's a wife and mom of 2 adorable small children. I don't know how you managed to do all of this. A yoga practitioner, an avid investor, and also a tea drinker. So she loves mastering new skills and learning new things. It's always part of her lifestyle. So welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for choosing to have this conversation. I know the work is always integrating the light and the dark within us. And just before we get started, I really love people to listen to this with the space of neutrality, because I know as a light worker yourself, it's always about being able to be the observer and to be able to see things through neutrality as much as possible. So it's never about making people right or wrong. It's about observing the behavior and then choosing our response accordingly. But it's also a really important conversation, right? Because we've probably all come up against some of these energies, or maybe even been the perpetrator ourselves at certain points. So Katie, from your perspective, what do you see? Let's just start with, what is emotional abuse? What is it to you?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really important topic, like you were saying. So emotional abuse is kind of like sneaky for a lot of people, especially when it comes to something like narcissistic emotional abuse. It sneaks up on people and they actually don't know that they're being abused a lot of times, versus physical abuse is apparent, right? Physical abuse causes some kind of apparent reality that's created, versus emotional abuse often is really sneaky, kind of undermining for people. And when it comes to something like a narcissist, oftentimes a lot of people don't even realize they're being emotionally abused for a long time until they start to realize it. And then they're like, wow, that was abuse, right? That was wrong of them to do certain things to me. So I feel like emotional abuse is often sneakier than a lot of things we actually don't realize it.
Somebody described it to me once like poisonous gas, like when it's like in the room and then it becomes like kind of like the boiling frog scenario as well. Like you don't realize because you're in it, and then it just becomes kind of more and more excruciating. So given that is really, and because often on the outside, people will look at it and go, if somebody's being emotionally abused, they should just leave the relationship, especially if it's romantic, right? But when you're in it, you're actually kind of seeing things through a different perspective.
Yes, all rose-colored glasses, right? Because a lot of times people that are emotionally abusive aren't emotionally abusive in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to hide that because that's not something that gets them into a relationship in the beginning, especially if it is the relationship, right? And this can even be family members too as well. Oftentimes they will go into, that like love-hate relationship where they're abusing people, but then they're being like, oh, I love you. What do you mean I'm not abusing you? So they cause a lot of psychological splits in the mind that creates people to end up staying with that abuser because they don't realize the impact it's creating.
Yeah. And this is also too why we come up against that problem when being able to support or help people who are in abusive relationships can feel extraordinarily difficult.
Yes. It is hard. It's hard to recognize. Sometimes you can't totally put your finger on it too. Even if you're external and you're watching somebody in a relationship where you feel like it's just not right, that's the sneaky part. That's like you're talking about the gas in the room. The gas you can't see, right? The gas you can't see, but it's like breathing in that gas for so long, you'll get those effects and eventually you'll have problems from it, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional problems from it later in life.
Okay, so how would you start identifying maybe even narcissistic behavior?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that people often think of narcissism is an exaggerated sense of importance, like somebody that really just thinks they're, super important. That's not always the case, especially with covert narcissists. They can almost seem like they make fun of themselves a little bit, but they always go back to me, right? It's about me. This is about me. This is not about anybody else in the world, often revolves around them. And it can feel really weird to people that don't have this sense because they don't understand it, right? It feels like almost maddening to others. Why does this person always go back to them? They talk about themselves a lot. Conversations always go back to them. So that exaggerated self-importance is something that you can kind of like start to pay attention to. Now, obviously there's people that aren't narcissistic they kind of can be jerky or talk about themselves a lot. But the lack of empathy is one thing that narcissists have, right? That's the lack of being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and only thinking about yourself. And again, that can be really weird for people that have a lot of empathy for people. It's like how this person doesn't know what they're necessarily doing because it is psychological disorder. However, it doesn't make them right for doing it to others.
Yeah, totally. And what came into my awareness as you were saying that, and in my kind of world, that would be service to self or service to others, and recognizing that that's a choice. My interpretation of narcissism is kind of being stuck in the need for significance, which is one of our 6 human needs, but we get stuck there. Seeing yourself as kind of flawless without any faults, not being able to take any responsibility or accountability. But one probably that is most alarming is not seeming to care about causing harm to others.
Yep. Yep. And that's a big one, right? They don't care. They will say things and do things and act like they didn't say it. And you're like, did you just say that? And other people will hear it. And like, how did that come? The words that are coming out of their mouth, how did that come out of somebody's mouth? Because somebody that lacks empathy, they don't care, right? They don't care at the core, versus somebody else that might just be like mad or sad, and something comes out of their mouth, they still have empathy. So it's difficult to fully understand when you come up against somebody like this, because you can't fully understand it unless you're inside of their brain. And right, that's hard to fully comprehend. It's like a psychopath, right? It's like, how do people hurt people? We don't know, because we're not those people. And that's why they're often studied, because it's a psychological disorder. And often, like you said, it's like you need to put them on the pedestal, right? You need to have excessive admiration for them. And if you don't, you will pay for it, because they're going to make you look bad if you don't put them on the pedestal.
Yeah. So, and again, I know this can, even talking about this can start activating a bit of fear, because literally coming up against people, it's kind of like they don't do any self-reflection. There's no accountability. Often, from my experience, I've noticed that untruths have been spoken, and that can make you feel kind of crazy. I think that's probably a telltale sign where you start questioning your own reality. So that kind of leads me into a little bit of like the empath and the narcissist, because that's a little bit of an attraction factor often there. Can you speak to that a little bit so people understand?
Absolutely. So narcissists are often attracted to empathic people because they lack empathy. So they're almost attracted, they're like flies to a flame, right? Moths to a flame when it comes to empathic people, because they just don't understand how people can be so compassionate for others, right? And they deep down, they do want that, right? It's like, this is a childhood psychological break, right? This is a problem, some trauma down the line. They crave that. But the problem is, when that happens, they end up being destructive to the empath, because they suck supply, energetic supply, emotional supply, and they gaslight that empath. So then the empath, who usually has a ton of compassion, usually feels other people's emotions, ends up feeling, number one, crazy that they're going through this. Number two, they usually burn out, right? Their candle is burnt. And then number three, they end up in this cycle where they want to heal the narcissist. Yes. Because they have so much empathy for them.
Yeah, and that becomes a trap.
It does.
Totally. So because I love that you mentioned the word supply and gaslighting, which is often used in the vernacular, right, around narcissists. What is gaslighting?
Yeah, so gaslighting is basically like, if you think about lighting gas on fire, right, in your reality. If you were to say something like, you hurt me, they would come back and say, I didn't do anything. And you would say, yes, you did. Remember when you said that thing that was really mean? They would say, I didn't say that. So they alter the state of reality that you're in when you go, I know that they said that. What do I need to do? Record it and play back? They would gaslight that. They would say, that's not my voice, right? They would never pin any type of behavior on them, because they are perfect, right? They have no flaws. They are perfect. So that gaslighting mentality creates the mind to start to go crazy, because then you start to think, well, am I crazy? I know I heard them say that, or I know that they did that on purpose, right? You did that on purpose. I felt like you did that on purpose. They would gaslight it and say, you're crazy. What are you talking about? I never would do that. And it leaves you thinking, right? It leaves the gap in the mind that you start to question your own reality and what you actually saw. It's crazy. And then they do it often, right? So this is like a kind of slow and steady ticking away. Gaslighting is often not, like, again, really apparent to people, especially if you're in a relationship or if you're in like the family line with them. You don't realize they're gaslighting you until you do. And then their behavior is predictable.
Oh, that's interesting, right? Yeah, recognizing that the behavior will become predictable because they're acting through pattern. Let's kind of drop a little bit deeper too, because I get that gaslighting, I've often heard they'll disregard your feelings, they'll deny things, they'll say, no, that didn't happen, or if I did say something unkind or nasty, I was just joking, and how could you not know that was a joke? So leaving you kind of feeling very emotionally vulnerable, I would imagine. What do you think causes somebody to be a narcissist?
So there's a couple of theories, like psychologically, and obviously I'm not like a psychologist. I've just worked with people's minds for a very long time, and I've dealt with narcissists myself. So mainly I would say like there's a trauma that happens when they're young. And usually it's traumatic experiences over time. Now, sometimes narcissists are often victims of narcissistic parents. They actually can merge with, and that's family constellation work, they can merge with their mother or their father and actually become narcissistic themselves. Now, other narcissistic traumas that can happen is where families kind of pit siblings against each other. That can cause a split in the psyche too as well. And then obviously like emotional, sexual abuse, things that we really wish that didn't happen in the world definitely can cause someone to become narcissistic. Now, there are some theories that people are born narcissistic, right? That there's something in the mind that comes through. I don't know if it's even like in the womb, but there are some theories that they're actually like they're born that way.
So I guess in a way, because I think one thing that the word that comes forward for me is kind of like a cover for deep insecurity. So in a way, it's kind of like a coping mechanism, but it's a coping mechanism where they're trying to, I feel, force their reality onto what is occurring, and it's just kind of going against universal laws. Yeah, and it makes it super tricky and difficult. So do you think, from your experience, that narcissists can heal? I guess it's the age old question, right? You have to
right. Can they, right? That's the question. So the short answer is probably no, because you have to be willing to look at your flaws and be willing to say there might be something wrong with me. And when it comes to, that's where the complexity comes. When it comes to narcissists, they don't usually go there. Right. They're not willing to go there. Now, there's probably certain types of specialties that might attract a narcissist and they could heal. But to my knowledge, I would say no in general. But again, it's a trauma, right? So if somebody can get to that trauma, they could probably heal. Now, usually what I see, especially with family constellation work sessions, is people that are victims of narcissists that really want to heal from the abuse. And you can, if you want to go to that level.
I've heard before that for a narcissist to be able to even look at their flaws or to take responsibility, that it could, and there, because it's so carefully constructed, that it could actually create another psychotic break essentially for them.
Yes, and that's true.
I refuse to go there. Yeah,
that's true. So I guess the short answer would be no. The long answer might be yes, if they're willing to go there. But sometimes people think in relationships that, oh, can my partner heal? And then they'll ask them to go get some help, and they're just going to deny it most of the time.
And I guess too, it's always different depending on the context of the relationship, because like you said, in romantic relationships, I know that there's often what they call love bombing to start with, and then the relationship might separate, and there's often a pattern of love bombing again for the people to come back together. There can be obviously parent-child and child-parent, even in terms of like the narcissistic behavior, and because it's going to always be different, but there's going to always be similar patterns, I guess. So what do you recommend for people if they're starting to identify like maybe there's some narcissistic behaviors here?
Yeah, so the first thing is like if you start to recognize it, reach out to like your friends and your family and just ask them if like, does this seem right to you? Is something going on with maybe my partner, or if it's like a family member? look for support that people see your point of view. Because when it comes to gaslighting, they're going to make you feel crazy and you're not going to want to reach out to anybody because you don't want them to think you're crazy. A lot of narcissists will hide themselves in front of people. So sometimes they won't see it, but if you reach out to friends and family, and that you can talk to them about it. Some narcissists will be kind of as crazy to check people's phones and make sure not, because they often split close people from your life too. So you don't have the support systems. They like to sever that support system because they don't want other people to know who they are really. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing would be to seek out therapy, right? To seek out a therapist or some kind of alternative therapy that's going to break you free from that patterning, right? If you want to choose that, and if you start to see that, and then you want to choose that for yourself to heal.
Yeah, because it's never going to be a case where you can get them to do it, right? You have to just, I think it's really important to recognize that it's always you in response to what is occurring, rather than needing, wanting, or wishing or hoping that the other people will get it and then go and get help themselves. It always comes back to the choice and the responses we're having to what is occurring. Totally. And even to, like working in spiritual worlds as well, like a lot of times people, especially empaths, really struggle with this stuff if they have a sense of spirituality, because they're like, it might be consuming them, but then they know that they're activating the law of attraction. So then it just keeps on compounding and there's more and more, and you're focusing on it and it kind of just gets worse and worse and worse, right? So to be able to step back from that and actually go, okay, I am going to take control over myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that's the overgiving too of empathic people. Sometimes we do get in that relationship or try to reach out to that person and really, really struggle to try to help them. And often it comes back to us as us having kind of like a burnout or feeling like we've failed them, right? Or feeling like we failed ourselves.
Yeah, totally. And then dealing with all of that in relationship to what is often occurring. So you mentioned before covert narcissist. What's a covert narcissist versus an overt narcissist? Really
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing like to distinguish. Usually covert are sneakier. Like you don't know that they're like a grandiose and overt narcissist is kind of like, that person might be a narcissist. They have very grandiose behavior. Covert is interesting because covert's kind of like a black widow spider. And I'm not speaking like black widows they're poisonous, right? They're sneaky. Most people don't recognize it until years down the line with covert. You can kind of, because that gaslighting thing, they do this well. It's actually a coping mechanism for them to keep their pedestal mentality because they don't want to break that reality. It's almost like the Twilight Zone. They're living in the Twilight Zone. They're living in an altered state. And then they usher everybody else around them to live in that state with them. And then all of a sudden you're like, I'm living in the Twilight Zone. So coverts are much more sneaky. Overts often are more like you can see them clearer, especially if you're not in the relationship with them and you're curious whether or not maybe your friend's husband is a narcissist. You can see the overt clearer, but the covert is very, very sneaky.
Yeah, and I guess that takes another level of awareness in regards to knowing how to deal, right? So, because some of the terminology as well, like there's a term that I've come across that's called, is it grey stone or grey rock? Like again, explaining that concept to enable to support people.
Yes. So yes, I've heard that term quite a bit. I feel like somewhat that narcissistic traits have come because a lot of people have been abused by narcissists, and it's much more readily available because people are coming out like about it and their struggles, right? So then, which is great because then other people can go, wow, that happened to me too. So the gray rock method is somewhat its own title, right? It's acting like a boring gray rock when you're around them. Like you act like you even talk super monotone. You don't even have expression. Like you're like, hello, nice to see you. Great, nice weather out here. So you don't actually, because you're not going to get the supply for you from you, because when you are a person that has a lot of joy, when you have a person that has a lot of expression, they target you actually, because they want to know what you have, and they want to basically plug into you, into your joy, because they don't experience that on a regular basis. So when dealing with a narcissist, often that gray rock method is effective, where you're not engaging emotionally with them. And then they basically just see you as a boring gray rock, and they don't pry on you anymore, right? They don't try to seek you out and almost like stalk you, or they don't try to make you feel, make themselves feel better than you. They literally ignore you. And sometimes that's actually the best place to be, because narcissists are persistent. They're interesting beings. They seek out that supply. It's like water to them. It's like vampires drinking blood. Right. They will seek out that supply if they need to.
Yeah, totally. So, and again, I guess if people, because I think often too, what happens is when you start to realize that people actually do behave like this and it is a thing, and you may be starting to gain more clarity, it can be a little bit shocking and disturbing. And I think one of the things, like for me especially, I was like, well, am I a narcissist? And the answer to that really is, if you're asking if you're a narcissist, the answer is no, because a narcissist would probably never ask themselves that. But because we know that reality is subjective, but this is still a thing. So again, maybe talk to me a little bit about what you think the gifts of a narcissist are, because for an empath, right? Because empaths need to learn to be empowered. So
yes. So yeah, there are a lot of gifts, right? The gifts of strength, a lot of times when people come out of these relationships, the gifts of boundaries, right, around people and what they're willing to allow into their lives. Because I will tell you that narcissists hate boundaries. They're the first ones to try to breach your boundaries. And it teaches you, right? In my own experience, it's taught me how to create better boundaries. And when I feel like somebody might have that tendency to breach it, right, I will question, like, why are you breaching my boundaries? And usually the reaction is like, it's your fault that I'm breaching your boundaries. You shouldn't have that many boundaries. You should be available to me at any time that I want you to be. And that's like the gift in it. Now, another gift is understanding psychologically, humanity has some form of narcissism in every person, right? We have a little bit of narcissism. That's the shadow aspect of us, right? And somewhat, I believe that by understanding a narcissist that's fully, like, that's more of their like archetypical trait, you almost learn a little bit about your own level of narcissism. It's like looking at your shadow, right? It's looking at your shadow in the mirror and going, that's interesting, right? And what's the difference between narcissists, right, being narcissistic, and just being empowered and kind of what we would consider, quote unquote, not selfish, right? Because we would say like, oh, this is so selfish, but what is the line between that, right? What is the line between that? And how can we heal that almost like shadow aspect of ourselves? Like, look, I was a little bit selfish there, right? Or I was a little bit, maybe a little narcissistic, not in the way where we take care of ourselves, not in the way where we set boundaries. But I do think that it bumps us up against our own little shadow that we need to look at. So that's also a gift. And even questioning, yes, we would not question, am I a narcissist, right? They often make us think, right, especially when you're in a relationship, that you are the problem, that maybe you are the narcissist. And you're like, how? No, because we wouldn't even be questioning or looking for this stuff if we were that person. So I feel like it's everything has a reason, right? And everything has a season. I think it does help to root us in our power. It helps us to look at our shadows a little bit, right? And it also helps us to gain more boundaries around our own being, right? Because they love to breach boundaries.
Yeah, and if you have any people-pleasing stuff going on coming across this, right, it's a recipe for disaster in terms of showing you very quickly that you are open to being taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. It's like, where am I open, right? Where can I tighten this up? And where did they enter to? I always ask people this as well. If their family, obviously we know where they entered. It wasn't like we necessarily attracted them, but they sometimes are attracted to us, especially if they're external family, like marriage and family. They will flock to us as empaths, which is really interesting, right? But with relationships, we can start to look at, where did they enter in our life? Was I vulnerable? Was I the prize? Did somebody like put me on a pedestal and they're like, oh my gosh, I wanted to be with this person because they seem so, they'll fit my image, right? They'll fit my image. So when you're in a relationship, you can kind of look at that and again look at the mirror. It's a gift if we can see it that way.
So in your experience, like, and again, like, we're looking at these behaviors, what do we need to know for ourselves in order to keep ourselves safe?
Yes, that's a great question. So if you're dealing with somebody that is narcissistic, oftentimes there's a couple things that you can do. Number one, that if you have to have contact with that person, you can do more of like the gray rock method, where you have to be around them, but you're just going to really like, don't let them plug into you. Right. So that's a safety mechanism where we can just shield ourselves. Like, imagine a bubble around yourself when you're going into that. Know that they're predictable. It's almost laughable sometimes how predictable they are. Even being like, watch, well, if you have a narcissist, be like, watch, I bet you they're going to say this. And they will. So knowing the patterning is empowering, knowing that they're predictable patterns, that can kind of keep us safe, because then we don't feel so shell shocked by it. Right. It's almost like you can just go off and kind of laugh about it. Like, oh, there's narcissistic, whatever, that's what you expect. So that does shield us a lot. And then the other thing is, like, if they are super in your life relationship, oftentimes going no contact with them is like the only option for a lot of people. Completely cutting them out of your life and just not speaking with them anymore. Now, to some people that might feel harsh, or I can't do that. And it's really up to you as a person what is better for you. But that's usually the best way, cutting them out or using the gray rock and really not engaging in their games.
Yeah, because I think also too that as humans, we have fear around being vulnerable anyway. And if we're vulnerable and then have somebody in our life that uses that awareness or information against us, it can be kind of horrifying.
Right? It is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is horrifying.
Yeah. And also too how the rational mind can love to rationale, right? Like, it likes to go into like, oh, they're behaving that way because of this, this, and this, or maybe they're having a bad day, but you can still come away feeling quite shell-shocked in regards to what unfolds. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I guess the thing is too, like, for myself, even in circumstances like it's taken quite a long time to actually get to a place to recognize, to even kind of put a label on it, to recognize certain behaviors. And even I know I was like, well, I don't want to label people. I don't want to label situations, right? Because that's kind of unkind and mean. But I guess it's greater levels of awareness, isn't it? Because when you're in it, you might not have any awareness of somebody having these kind of behavior or attributes. There is no frame of reference. There is no label. So even having that awareness can create those greater levels of clarity to help learn how to manage it.
Yeah, and that's so good to say too as well. And I'll say this, something that's helped even people that I've worked with as clients is you can put the label on it because it also helps you navigate it, right? It's like, where am I going? Am I going to New York? So I need to go to New York instead of going to this plot of land up there, right? So it gives you some ways to navigate it. But the other thing that really helps people kind of heal around it is look at the underlying patternings that they have, right? Look at the underlying emotions that they have, like feeling like they're a disappointment, right? Feeling like they're neglectful, feeling like they're abusive, feeling like they're angry. So some of the things that underlying it, you almost can look at that as a like a ball, right? So like the narcissistic is this, right there, the label of the narcissist, but then what's inside of that, right? And it makes you, it does make you still have empathy for them, because we don't want to dehumanize anybody. That's not the purpose. However, it's not okay for them to dehumanize anybody else either, right? Sometimes people are like, well, narcissists are just traumatized people. Well, so are psychopaths, but it doesn't make it okay for them to kill people, right? So it doesn't make it okay for narcissists to abuse people. And that's the truth. It doesn't make it okay. Even though we can see that ball of humanness for what it is, it does help us navigate it. And as empathetic people, right, and really like emotionally stable people, joyful people, people that want this, creators, right, light workers, we have this joy. We do not have to stoop to that level. We don't have to stoop into that vibration.
Yeah. And again, I love that you're saying that too, because I think one of the things that comes up for me is injustice, right? That it's unjust.
Yeah.
But there's a good chance that you're never going to get an apology from a narcissist, right? Like they won't ever see themselves as being in the wrong to be able to offer an apology. So that in itself is kind of like the next up level, isn't it? Because you just have to resolve that within yourself rather than needing or wanting from something from somebody else.
They'll never apologize. And it does feel weird, right? That you're like, why wouldn't they just apologize for that horrible thing that they said? They lack the capacity to do that. And somewhat we have to just cut that off and just saying like, I'm willing to forgive that, but I'm not willing to forget that. And I'm also not willing to endure that capacity. I'm not willing to go to that level.
Yeah, not available for that anymore.
Mm-mm.
So tell me, in your experience, Katie, from working with people, if they've had a partner who has been, and then they've moved beyond that relationship, what happens for that person in terms of engaging in other relationships?
Yeah, so usually with somebody that has, especially if you've been in a long relationship or you had a narcissistic family member, it takes a while to heal and really feel safe with somebody else. It really does. So there's a lot of developing coping mechanisms. Finding the awareness too, like where did that penetrate my mind? So it does take time for most of these people. A lot of times people do heal by speaking out about their issues, whether it's, some people help people now with narcissistic behaviors because they've been through it themselves, and that's super healing for people. But sometimes it's even just talking with your really close friend or somebody that you trust and you feel safe with. And that's a key thing. When you've gone through that abuse, you're going to have trouble feeling safe with people. You're going to have a lack of trust around people because when your reality is altered, you lose trust in yourself, right? And when you do that, you project it right onto others. I can't trust this person because I was gaslighted for so long. And you stop trusting your intuition. You stop trusting your signals, even your bodily signals to some degree. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. Sometimes people with narcissistic abuse can even go into addictions, overeating, gaining weight, getting into other bad relationships. So the best thing that I usually, advice around this is give yourself time to heal and trust yourself again. And once you develop that internal trust again and know that you weren't crazy and know that there's safe people out there, and then you can move forward into the next transition into your next level of your life.
Yeah, and safety first always, right? And that's always created within ourselves. Wow, that's amazing. And I feel like that's given a really good snapshot of, I guess, what to be aware of and the impacts. And from what you're saying energetically, what I'm picking up to is that there's a real kind of balance and neutrality that you can kind of get to once you're aware of the behaviors and take ownership within yourself. And that's so important in terms of knowing, because I would imagine now you have a pretty good antennae in regards to recognizing this stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Being able
Yes.
to, and that's probably one of the best forms of safety, is to be able to recognize it pretty quickly.
It is. It is a great form of safety. Now, sometimes people will get into, and I want to just comment on this because not everybody's a narcissist, right? Right. Sometimes people will be like, oh, my ex-boyfriend was a narcissist, and this other person was, and this other person was. It's like, no, some people are just jerks, and they're not necessarily or they just didn't want to pursue something, or they had a different view in life, and then they'll label people as narcissists because they were mean to them, or they were a little bit of a jerk to them, or a lot of a jerk, right? So it's important to distinguish that everybody's not a narcissist, but there definitely are narcissistic people out there, and they do pry on people that when they're vulnerable. So I always say, like, if I feel like a little bit more vulnerable, I'll wonder who's coming into my life when I feel more vulnerable. Like, does a weird friend enter that I'm not really sure that I want to be friends with, but they pursue our friendship, right? So pay attention to when you're vulnerable. Your antenna does go up because you're more aware. Awareness is really, really key, right? It's very key. And really it makes you more selective also to some degree, like who you're willing to allow into your circles, right? Not like a barrier where you don't let anybody in. But when you've gone through things with people that are abusive, you do choose your friends wisely, at least your close circle wisely. And I think that does help you really cope and heal from it.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that too, because I've even seen that kind of behavior, hence my unwillingness to label things, because you've seen where people are like, oh, this person's been a jerk, so then they get labeled a narcissist. And I mean, I've literally had somebody say that to me about somebody that I know, an ex-boyfriend, and I was just like, no, that person's not a narcissist. But it comes back to what's going on deeper, but the interpretation of it is super important, which is why we don't want to just stick a label on something. Because in my experience, I don't feel like narcissists are actually that common.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not that common, but you'll know it, I guess, when you come across it.
You will, and you often don't. When you haven't identified it, like if you're kind of new to it, you've never really encountered a narcissist. Other people will often say this: there's just something weird about them, right? I don't think they know what they're doing when they say something mean, right? I don't really think that they know what they're doing, which is true, but it's not an excuse for the behavior, right? It's not excusing the behavior. It's knowing that the behavior is there, but you're just not willing to be available for that.
Let's talk about this finally, and as a bit of a bridge in terms of you helping people to evolve. Do you feel like this kind of energy can hold people back from creating a business that they really freaking love?
Absolutely. Especially if there is a narcissist in your family, right? Or if you've been in a long-term relationship with a narcissist, because really business also builds our spiritual muscle of trust. So if that trust is broken, then we have trouble moving forward in our next level. Right? It's like we push and pull with it. It's like we get to that level of, oh my gosh, it's too scary. I can't really trust myself anymore. And then we sink back down into the old ways. This is human, right? We can say ourselves for being silly humans, right? And forgive ourselves for it. However, if you have that level of abuse and you've gone through it, you will bounce on those upper limits, right? You will bounce. You'll hit that limit and then you'll bounce back down because you can't fully trust yourself.
Mm.
So that's why like the healing journey through this and really healing those wounding, right? That wounding, whether it was a narcissistic father, a narcissistic mother, a narcissistic partner, a narcissistic sister, right? That wounding can bump up against us when we expand, because it feels too unsafe and we haven't been able to trust ourselves enough because we dagger in the back, right? It's like something is going to come. We expect that again.
Yes, yes, right, because we're wired to keep ourselves safe. And what I would love to point out about this is, which I see all the time, and people don't realize that they're just looking often at the problem, but they don't realize how subconscious this is.
Yes.
It's really, you're in it often and you're kind of trying to figure it out using your rational mind. And then again, it's the subconscious. I'm not safe. This is dangerous. If I go to this next level, am I going to get stabbed in the back? All that kind of stuff becomes very conscious once you start tapping into it. So I love that you spoke to that. And it's so powerful in regards to making those quantum leaps in your business and going to the next level. I'm sure you've seen that a million times before.
Oh yeah. Yes, it's essential, right? To some degree. If you're not like feel held in that space, you'll just bounce back down to the old ways. And that's why sometimes people attract, like they hit the big months they're making in their business and then they somehow lose it, right? Or they self-sabotage themselves, right? When they're getting in a relationship and they're like, oh, that person is really great for me, but they don't trust them enough. Even though they're like the perfect partner, they can sabotage themselves because it feels too good. Or you expect them to be untrustworthy. If you don't fully heal that wounding that is within your reality.
Totally, totally. And it's all interconnected. The success, the money, the business, relationships, it's all interconnected. So again, when you shift it on, you might be looking at the aspect of money or relationship, etc., romance, but it shifts everything, doesn't it?
It does, because they're all interrelated, right? So we are conscious beings, everything feeds into each other, right? And it will cause other issues. So oftentimes when people are having relationship issues, it'll bleed into their company. And oftentimes company will bleed into their family, or money will, right? Because money is just a frequency, it's just a currency. When your currency and your frequency is within that safe of place of not trusting, not joyful, waiting for the shoe to drop, it will block. It'll block that from coming to you at the capacity that it could. Now, people can still be successful and have these wounds. However, I find that they will always bump up against it at some point, and they often don't know what that thing is. It's like, I have this block and I can't get past it, right? I have this thing and I keep bumping up against it. It's so deeply unconscious. They don't know how to move through it. You can't push through this. You really have to heal and integrate it, right? Transmute it, right? At an energetic frequency level, at a soul level, to actually move beyond it.
Yeah, you're so talking my language right now, because also too, that burnout happens when people keep on pushing because they're not stopping to actually go, I need to go into the subconscious to figure this out, and I need to connect with somebody who's going to facilitate me through it, because it's so difficult to do that for yourself because you're in it.
Yes.
Yes.
You can't. You could, I would say, like, it is very hard to facilitate it for yourself. Like, I know that I don't really facilitate all the healing for myself either, right? I have people that help me facilitate that because we all do have blinders on. We can't see all our little areas where we need to work on because we are in our own stuff.
Totally. So that's super powerful. So if people want to learn more about you, Katie, whereabouts do they go to find you? What's your website?
Yeah, so it's beyondinstitute.org. That is my website. I'm very active on Facebook and LinkedIn. So I'm also able to be contacted there, just Katie Edwards Corbin on Facebook. If you look me up, I do have two profiles. So I have my business page, and then I have a personal profile that I use for my business too as well. And then LinkedIn, I'm very active too as well. I'm just under Katie Edwards Corbin.
Awesome. So if you're listening, folks, and this is resonating with you, make sure that you reach out to Katie, connect with her either on one of those platforms and learn more. Super powerful content. Every time I've scrolled on Facebook and there's often a one-liner, you're just like, boom, right there. So that's Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like this information it's a touchier subject, but it's super value. And I love the fact that you bring a lot of neutrality to it. You've obviously helped other people heal through this to reach their up and beyond their upper limits as well. So thank you so much, right? I love that you're doing this amazingly powerful work.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be able to talk about this with you too as well.
Yeah, it's important. It's important work. All right, everybody, thank you so much. I appreciate you for being here, for tuning in and listening, and we'll connect with you again very soon. Bye for now. Bye.